Good afternoon, everyone. If you don't know who I am Greg Clapp. I do a little work for this event. This presentation that we're about to see, it's called Clippermania, featuring Dr. Bill Clapp, and yes, the same Clapp. Clapping is appropriate. I'm going to just read that real quick, the official bio. Hit me up later for the unofficial bio. Bill and his wife, Carol, grew up in San Diego and moved to Utah 40 years ago. They recently moved to Cocoa, Florida, in celebration of their 50 years of marriage. They had 3 wonderful children, and that even includes Greg. Thank you for that.
I actually wrote that line.
Dr. Bill Clapp is a retired Air Force Reserve Colonel and was a senior research scientist for Air Force Research Laboratory. And on a personal note, growing up with Dad, he's always been involved with Air Force and aeronautics. It was sort of a family profession. His father before him was involved in aeronautics, and as a result, I have developed a similar love of flying and air history and just everything to do with that, although I'm not very knowledgeable about it. So that's why he's here. So with that, let's begin. And I'm going to be running the slides, so if I miss something, please bear with me.
Just blame it on the blind guy. I am blind, so if you get tired of the presentation, just be really, really quiet. I will think you left. And I'll be really quiet. I want to dedicate this presentation to my darling wife, Carol, 50 years as of the 28th of June. And I can remember like it happened yesterday, the day we got married. I can remember our first event at a Presbyterian youth group camp. And I can remember that the day that we gave birth to Greg, scariest day of my life as our first child. And I can remember like it happened yesterday. Now I will, and there's some stories about Greg I'll be able to share with you too.
Should we tell them how much I weighed when I came out?
Okay. Carol, please stand up so people know who you are. I mean, I can remember she was with me for 2 years before we got married. On one of our dates before we got married, we were, just like I always did, I went out to the airport and we kind of hung around and saw little airplanes take off, and this one man and an instructor pilot comes up and says, "Hey, you want to go for a night flight?" Sure. So Carol and I got in the back seat of a Cessna 172, and for an hour we flew over San Diego at night. Beautiful, the lights. It was like fantasy land. It turned really miserable when I got home and told her mother where we were. That was not a good day. And I can remember when I was out in the practice area, I flew over the high school at a prescribed time, and Carol was in the middle of the quad, and I flew fairly low, probably lower than I should have, and did some circles around and rocked my wings, and I don't know what she was saying to the group, like probably, "I have no idea who that is, he's an idiot." And then after I got my pilot's license, I remember taking Carol for her first small airplane ride, a little Cessna 150, and it was in the summer in San Diego. The hot air turbulence were just blasting that airplane all over the place. I couldn't go above 1,000 feet above the ground because I'd lose the horizon. I was on visual flight rules only, and every time we hit a bump, you'd want to hit the ceiling. There's nothing to hang on to. There's no armrest, and I don't think she liked that flight. She never went flying with me after that. So this is dedicated to her. Now, I'm a crazy kind of individual. When I was in elementary school, I wanted to fly, and I can remember going to my dad's workshop and making some wings and covering them with cloth with a stapler and going down the street to the only vacant house we had in the neighborhood, because anybody else, they would have ripped me off the roof and say, "You can't go up there." So I climbed up on the roof and I jumped off the roof of this house in San Diego, and the wings did not work. So the next day I went up there. These are some stories that Greg has never heard. I went back up there the next day with one of my mom's big bed sheets, and I tied all 4 corners of the rope because I figure if my wings don't work, I need a parachute. And I jumped off the roof again, and the parachute didn't work. And I can remember a neighbor and I, a young kid named Kenny, we would stop by the carpentry shop where build cabinets, and they gave us all kinds of scrap lumber, and we had the frame of an airplane in the canyon, but we never knew how to put it together, so it never got anywhere. Now, I can remember standing out at Convair, and my dad worked at Convair, so he has an aeronautical background. He was the tech rep of F-102s and F-106s. And I can remember going out he invited me to go to work, and I stood right next to a Ryan pogo stick. Now, you're going to have to look that up. It's an experimental airplane. Nobody died in it, but it would take off vertically. It had big 12-foot counter-rotating propellers and a little teeny body, and it would just take off and go. And so I can remember doing that and I can remember asking my father, "Where are you going, Dad?" "Well, I'm leaving town on a business trip. I'm going to Cape Canaveral." I said, "What do you do there?" "Well, and I don't know if he even understood the language that he used, but I said, "I'm responsible for the navigation and the control of the Atlas ICBMs that were in their late 50s and early 60s. So, and he used to tell me all the stories. And one of the stories he told me was, I was there and we pushed the button and the rocket blew up about a couple 100 feet off the pad. And, I was late coming home because we were locked in the blockhouse because the flames were so intense it took 48 hours to cool off the blockhouse. It cracked the blockhouse 4 foot thick of concrete before my dad could get out. And the story that he remembers is he was the only engineer from San Diego from General Dynamics who made the missile that said, I brought my travel suitcase into the blockhouse. All the other friends of mine who came, they left theirs in the assembly building and that burned down. So I have had a crazy background. I have been very blessed that Carol was there also when I was taking flying lessons. And I said, you want to come with me? I'll just be up in the air for an hour for a flying lesson. Well, as I was ready to taxi out with the instructor got out and stood next to Carol. And he yelled back in. He says, this is your solo flight. Go ahead. So Carol was right there talking to the instructor. I don't know what she said to the instructor. They probably said, well, there goes your airplane. You'll never see that again. So she was there for that. She's been at my side, by my side, on thick and thin. That's part of my interest in flying. I've been so blessed. I was able to go on an F-4 ride out of Naval Air Station, North Island, in the back seat of an F-4 on a test run after it was rebuilt. I've been able to sit in the pilot's seat of a C-130 flying across the Rockies and all the mountaintops were just white with snow. I washed out of pilot training in 1971 at Williams Air Force Base because they kept rupturing my sinuses, so my dream of flying ended. But then I went into maintenance. And let me tell you, the first time I ever fixed an airplane, it was in 1969. We got an opportunity to fly from San Diego up to Beale Air Force Base, and it was in a C-97. So what? It's a big 4-passenger propeller airplane. Well, it happens to be a B-29 that was converted because Boeing made B-29s that was used in World War II, but they also made a bunch of C-97s for the Air Force. So I was in the C-97 with 100 students, and on the way back, we're getting our airplane. It's Sunday. All the reserve pilots want to go home, and they couldn't get the pitch working on one of the left engines. I could hear the crew chief yelling to the pilot, and the pilot yelling back, we don't have pitch control. We have pitch control. We don't. We do. We don't. And that crew chief was back there opening the panel, and he was wiggling the connector. And it was working, and it wasn't working. You have to remember that airplane was over 20 years old, and that connector probably had been disconnected 100,000 times. And it didn't work. But I was an electromechanical assembler, and I was sitting like in the first row, not too far from him, and I went up to him and said, I have a temporary fix for you. What is it? We want to go home. I said, you have a needle and those pliers? Yes. You need to take that connector, show me that, and all the pins, you need to bend them about 15 degrees so it puts side pressure on the inside of that connector. Don't bend it very far, you'll break the pins and then we won't be able to go home. So he carefully, with his needle and his pliers, bent the pins, put the pin back in, and the pilot said, we're good, let's go. That was the first time I fixed the airplane, and then I ended up in the Air Force as a maintenance officer and the chief of maintenance of a mobile radar unit, and then Air Force Research Laboratory the last 6 years as a research scientist. So I know a little bit about airplanes, But I have invited somebody here that Greg doesn't know about, who knows more about the airplanes than I do. And it's going to take a little bit of work to get him down here because he died in 1994. And so I'm going to ask him to come, and he does have permission. So when he's here, I want you all to meet Robert Ford. Oh my goodness. How did I get down here? Was it you, Bill, that did that? I can stay for about 40 minutes. I have special permission. When I was called to St. Peter's Gate. I was been waiting there, and all of a sudden I was flashed down here. Bill, all Peter said to me was, there's a lot of important people down here, and they need to hear from you. So I am here. I am Robert Ford, not Bob. If you're thinking of Bob, that's Bob Hope. And I'm not Bob Hope. But I want you to know that I worked for Pan Am for a number of years. I worked for Pan Am, and I worked for the founder. Go ahead, slide number 2. Juan Trippe. Now, you think Juan is a funny name. He was named after his grandmother, Juanita. But Juan he was a naval flyer also. And if you can imagine a naval flyer, and he was at the end of World War I, and then he got out and he started his own business. So he was a good friend of mine. So I was a naval flyer also. Now the scariest part about flying float planes. Now the difference between a float plane has floats instead of wheels. Now, what's the difference between a clipper or a flying boat? The hull of the ship is also a boat and has to be certified as a boat. Not in the little float planes that I used to fly for the Navy. The scariest part of flying those little float planes is I would sit in the cockpit and their big, large crane run by not a very high-ranking person lifted my airplane off the back of the deck, swung it over the side, and lowered me into the water while I was in the cockpit because it's too hard to get out of the airplane when the airplane is floating. And then we'd take off, and that's what the naval aviators did before this time. So we had a background, and I was hired by Juan Trippe, and I ended up being the chief pilot in the Pacific. But let's do slide number 3. Oh, and I need to play my little device. If you see an earbud in my ear, that's because I know what slide number 3 is if it works. Okay. Okay, the first airplane that Juan bought was the Fokker F-7. Then he bought the Fokker F-10. Now, he flew his first airmail flight from the Florida Keys to Havana, Cuba, and he got a contract for airmail, one of the first contracts ever. And it was not a seaplane, it was a wheeled airplane. And then all of a sudden there was a new round of contracts. The government came out at $2 per mile. We can have you deliver mail. So Juan says, oh my goodness, I don't have to drive that mail truck all the way out to the Florida Keys. I'm going to move my base to Miami, and I can get twice the $2 per mile and make more money. So he did. And you're on number 4?
Now we're on number 4.
Now we're on number 4. We'll get this down when he learns to think the way I think without having to tell him. Number 4, and he never was very good at that. That's why he ended up leaving. So you kind of wonder why Charles Lindbergh. Charles Lindbergh was a friend of Juan Trippe. When Charles Lindbergh flew across the Atlantic, Juan Trippe was there in New York when he left. They were friends. And so it's amazing the contributions that Lindy made to the Pan Am story. Next.
Number 5.
Then we did, and then we bought a first flying boat, which is Sikorsky 38. And we eventually bought Sikorsky 42s, the next bigger version. But the Sikorsky 38 just couldn't go very far. But we expanded our route into, now from Havana, with Lindy in the driver's seat. We contracted Lindy to fly the first routes over the Caribbean. So he went down to the southern tip, to the northern tip of South America, and then cut across to Puerto Rico. And because we hired him, he was a wonderful HR speaker for us, which that helped us get the contracts to do the other airmail. And Lindy was a whole lot of fun. Now, go ahead into the next.
Are we on 7?
And this is, there's a picture of Amelia Earhart, and standing next to her is a guy named Fred Noonan. And you think, oh, Fred Noonan? He left Pan Am to have a safe career because it was too dangerous flying across out into the Pacific. He was on that Lockheed Martin when that airplane was lost. He was there as the navigator because Fred was one of the best navigators in the world. He could fly for 500 miles, and he would say, in 1 minute, we're going to come up to an island 3 miles to our right, and you look out the cockpit. This is dead reckoning. And he would have a little window up above where he could look at the stars if it wasn't cloudy. And if it was windy, he would drop out flags out the side window and watch to see which way it blew, so he knew if we had a crosswind, they had to adjust. Okay. 1935. Are you there on the...
Slide 8.
Okay. Is that a picture of the China Clipper?
It is.
Okay. On that airplane, when that China Clipper left in 1935, was piloted by Edwin Musick, M-U-S-I-C-K. We call him Ed. He was the chief pilot for the Pacific there. He flew all the routes to organize to all the islands of which he traveled. And at his side was Fred Noonan. Fred Noonan was there, and they surveyed all these islands, and they made it possible, that combination. Now, when they left, on that flight, they were building the Oakland Bay Bridge. That M. Martin 130, which is the next bigger class airplane that could make it to Hawaii because the Sikorsky 42 couldn't make it there, and they had to, first flight, they had to empty out all the seats and put in extra gas tanks. But now that we had the Martin 130, he could fly all the way. So it went under the cables of the Oakland Bay Bridge. And if some of the pictures are not high resolution, I have somewhere, maybe Greg can grab it, the camera. I have a camera from the 30s. And if he holds it up, it's a little bellows. That's all people had, the passengers. There were not photographers around with the big, huge cameras. So some of these slides, some of these pictures were taken with this little teeny camera, and it's so unique that if you open the door on the back of the camera, it has a little scratcher on it that if you want to write somebody's name down, you scratch it right on the film itself. And you close the little door, and then you have it developed. And so some of these shots. And then you see the Golden Gate Bridge in the background. Now, they left on an island that wasn't quite yet built that they were working on. It's called Treasure Island, and we'll cover that in a second. 9. The route across the Pacific was the longest route is from San Francisco to Honolulu, which is 2,400 miles. That's longer than almost the whole flight crossing the Atlantic. Juan Trippe wanted to do the Atlantic route because there was a lot more money, but he could never get the rights to fly. The longest leg, if you fly up and around in the Atlantic, is 500 miles. When Charles Lindbergh flew across, he didn't go to Greenland and Iceland and go up through the northern route. He flew straight across on a straight shot, and that didn't happen for years later. Okay, then from the first leg is, of course, San Francisco to Honolulu, and that flight took 18 hours. You have to remember those old airplanes didn't even go 180 miles an hour, and they were at 11,000 feet, so they could not fly above the storms. So any little bump, if they went around, they'd be hours late on some of these storms. And the next island is Midway, and you've heard the World War II stories about World War II and Midway. And Midway was midway between, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And then what's the next island you see up there? Wake Island. You see, it was Juan Trippe that couldn't figure out how to get from Wake Island to Guam. He found a little atoll. And what is an atoll? It's a sandbar. And he found this out there, and it was very important during World War II because we built runways on it during World War II. And then we went to Guam, and then we flew on to Manila. The China Clipper did not go all the way to China for some time. And the first year the China Clipper was flying, it never carried passengers. They were carrying airmail, because I don't think anybody wanted to pay the exorbitant fees to travel to Manila, because it was just way too expensive. And he was making a lot of money at $2 a mile plus, depending on the weight of the payload. Now, they made such history that they made a postage stamp. And you may have seen this in some collectors. It's a valuable stamp, but there's the Martin M130 on a postal stamp. And it was minted within a year after the first flights in 1935 out of. Now, I want to share with you today, excuse me, the Boeing 314. Juan Trippe was not satisfied with the Martin 130. Yes, please. We practiced this to make sure I wouldn't be able to spill it. And I'll hand it to him carefully, not spill it over his head. So what was it like, the Boeing 314? The Boeing 314 was such a remarkable airplane that Juan Trippe says, I need a bigger airplane than the Martin 130. And he went to Boeing, and Boeing said, we don't have an entry. There was a young man, 27 years old, who was a salesman for Boeing, and he was representing Boeing to the Chinese, and his job was to sell the Boeing P-1 pea shooter fighter. Well, I guess that didn't go very well, so he, at his kitchen table, drew up the plans for this Boeing 314. His wife did all the color illustrations on the kitchen table, and they took it to Boeing, and then Boeing showed Juan Trippe, and he says, I want that airplane. Okay, 12.
Oh, we were on 12.
Okay, then I'll do the next one. Okay. Now, do you believe that's the inside of the wing? That airplane had a wingspan of 152 feet. It had a catwalk going out to the airplane, to the far engine. They call inboard and outboard engines. And during the 3 years that the Boeing 314 flew in the Pacific and South Pacific, there were 400 in-flight repairs done. So if you can imagine the conversation between the pilot and the engineer saying, we're losing oil pressure in engine number 3, and the pilot would say, go ahead, I will shut down, to the engineer, I will shut down engine number 3, so they shut it down. The guy would walk out in the catwalk, he had an extra oil filter, he would unbolt it, put in a new oil filter, come back in after being out there in the wing, in that noisy wing, and he would tell the pilot, and the pilot would say, okay, we'll turn engine 3 back on. So there were over 400 in-flight repairs done in the 3 years that Pan Am was flying it from 1938 to 1941. Now, the flight deck was so big, it was 9 foot wide and 21 feet long. It had a 7-foot navigation table. So all the navigation was, where are all the coral reefs? Where are the ship routes? Where is everything to get us to our destination that Fred Noonan needed and the navigators needed to navigate to that place? Because at the time, their navigation techniques were kind of crude. All they had was, one, looking out the window, do you see the island? No. And if you don't see it, can your star navigation work? Yes, at night. What about during the day? Well, we can use our compass, but it's off by quite a few degrees. And on the Amelia Earhart, to go back to that for 1 second, Fred Noonan would never have gotten lost. What they found was the charts that Amelia Earhart had. Howland Island was off by 10 miles. And we think he headed further north by missing the island and in desperation landed on an island that was controlled by the Japanese. And for her airplane then was possibly hauled away. That's the latest story, because if you knew Fred Noonan, he would not make a mistake like that. He was too good of a navigator. And what they used for navigation also was radio navigation. If you've ever seen on these old models, there's a loop antenna sitting on the top behind the pilot and co-pilot. That's about 18 inches in diameter, and it rotates, and underneath there's a calibrated dial. So when you're flying straight, you can aim that antenna, and then you pick up an AM radio station on the different islands. So it could have also been that maybe the transmitter went down because they were all vacuum tube transmitters, and Amelia Earhart only had one radio. She did not have a backup radio. So if that radio went dead, she would not have the radio navigation that would get them to the islands. Or maybe the transmitter went down. We don't have any history on that. Now, the crew of that airplane, it was huge. 11 on the crew. So you had the pilot. You had the first officer, second officer, third officer, fourth officer, 2 navigators, 2 radio men, pursers. And if you notice, we say pursers, and they were all men until 1946. There were not any women on board because a purser not only was setting the table and making everybody feel comfortable, when that airplane came in to port, they would be jumping down outside the airplane and walking on the flotation devices and having to tie the airplane up at the Mobile docks. And that was considered to be too dangerous and too dirty for women to do. So women came not until during the war, and other airlines started hiring women because the men were all off fighting the war, and they started to bring in women, and women then became so dominant that men were no longer, they had to reverse that later on to bring some men back in as flight attendants. Now, the Boeing 314 was really large, with also 152 feet. The radial engines, and I have a picture of a radial engine. Each one of those radial engines, 1,600 horsepower, 9 pistons up front, and another row of 9 pistons down below. So there are 18 pistons on each engine. So how many is that with 4 engines? That's 72 pistons working like mad to get to their destination. So what's the odds of one of those breaking? It was pretty common. It was a very high maintenance airplane. Now, if you see how the radial engine is very flat. It was used extensively in World War I on the old biplanes because it was air-cooled. But now we needed sleeker and better engines. So the radial engines, there weren't very many left. It was only on slow airplanes because it was not aerodynamic. And so they went to water-cooled engines a little bit later in World War II. So if you see the World War II fighters, they're very long-nosed and sleek. That's because there's a 12-cylinder engine, 12 or 14-cylinder engine in there that starts at the very front, goes all the way to the back, which takes up a lot of room, and then you had the radiators. And that gave them the extra 200 miles an hour. They could go faster because there wasn't such a big upfront radial engine in the way. Now the performance was, out of all these airplanes, 12 made by Boeing, and Pan Am bought 9 of them. 3 of them went to Europe, and none of them are still around. They were all scrapped. One of them, they're trying to raise money in Seattle. It went out when the pilot left. This was 1946, after the war. All the Pan Am Clippers were absorbed by the military and used extensively in the military. They were bringing back a crew of Navy personnel and passengers, and 2 hours out of Honolulu, they had engine trouble. Both engines on one side had problem, and they decided to land the airplane, so they landed in between 2 swells. Now imagine this at night, because they flew at night. You have an altimeter that is only good to plus or minus 1,000 feet, depending if you know the barometric pressure. And when you're out and away from Hawaii, when you land at any airport, they still tell you, this is a Salt Lake City Tower, barometric pressure 29.992, because the pilot then adjusts his altimeter, then it's accurate to about 25 feet. But you get the barometric pressure. I didn't bring it with me, but I have an old antique TWA Boeing 707 altimeter at home, and I have watched that thing vary by 1,000 feet when a storm goes through. So you think when the lights, when that engine quit and it was dark, that pilot did a landing on the ocean at night with an altimeter that could have been off by 1,000 feet. And with the headlights on let's see, that was the Boeing 314. He made a perfectly successful landing. Within 4 hours, they were rescued by a passing ship. They sent a destroyer out from Honolulu to pull the crippled Boeing 314 back, but you cannot tow seaplane because it doesn't have a rudder. So it actually swung around and hit the side of the destroyer, and it broke off the end of the wing, so they knew they weren't going to fly it or repair it. It was in the shipping channel, so they had to sink it. They put 1,300 rounds of 20 millimeter cannon shell into that Boeing before it sank. And there was another one that was lost, but all of those airplanes are gone. Now, they did a whopping speed of 188 miles an hour. That was significant over the Martin 130s. Now, 3,600 miles. Now, surface ceiling of 19,000 feet, they averaged about 11,000 or 12,000 feet elevation. So they didn't climb over any storms whatsoever. They went through every storm. So if you can imagine the horrific bouncing, if you think it's bad when you're landing, when you are down a few thousand feet above the ground, that's the way it was like traveling in those old airplanes. Go ahead, the next slide is the brochure.
Yep.
And Pan Am was really advertising, because Pan Am, if you think of what Pan Am did, we had the Roaring '20s, then we had the Great Depression, and we were coming out of the Great Depression in the early '30s. And then that's when Juan Trippe was opening up Pan American Airlines. And so nobody had any money, but it all became a wish of the rich and famous to go flying. And that's where Clippermania comes in. When you see what's in this airplane, and I'm going to show you what's in this airplane. Now that's 19. Go ahead, 19.
Okay.
There are the pursers that would help you. And then 20, seating diagram on this airplane. There were 7 rooms. There were 5 lounges for the people to sit. And you're not going to believe, they just had couches. They didn't have seatbelts. And the couches were sofa beds. So when you wanted to sleep, you would get up off the couch and you would go to the change room, which is the men or women's bathroom, and you would change into your pajamas, and you would go back and you would lay down on your couch and fall asleep. Maybe, depending on how much bouncing around. Now, the room at the very end of the airplane, 21, the main lounge was also converted into a dining room. So the pursers were setting up the china on the tables, and they wore their dress uniforms, and you'd have to eat in shifts because you all couldn't fit in the dining room at the time, and you got to dine with the captain. Does that sound familiar with like ships? You get to dine with the captain on some of the long flights. There's a picture of the sleeping quarters when they're getting ready. Of course, there's no such thing, or not such thing as a seatbelt. I don't know if the pilots even wore seatbelts at that time. I know the Wright brothers airplane did not have seatbelts. The seat was pretty tight. So when they crashed, you went flying through all the rigging and ended up on the ground, and they thought that was better than getting all mangled up in the airplane. Okay. What I forgot to tell you, because they were also officially certified as ships, that every one of Pan Am's airplanes were christened by famous people. And they all had names. You can think Honolulu Clipper, Pacific Clipper, just every name you can think of, they all had their own names. Now, there's a picture of the comfortable seating. 25, this is a cutaway version that is now in a museum, but I read an article on the daughter who saw her father build this, and it took him a long time to build this in his workshop, this cutaway model that Pan Am used to advertise and to photograph of what it was like. Now, the most important room, the tail had a room, that's the 7th room, which is the honeymoon suite. And that was the talk of the time as far as luxury. Now, the next one is, now that you're familiar with the Pan Am, I want to take you on a trip. Now, this is, you have to remember who I am. I'm Robert Ford, and I'm going to take you on my most famous Pan American flight ever. And I want to welcome you to the terminal on Treasure Island. Now, this was built in 1938 during the San Francisco Exposition, because remember, we're coming out of a depression. They took the swampland inland of the San Francisco harbor, and it was just full of weeds and all kinds of bad stuff, and they dredged that and made a 400-acre island. And it was for the exposition, so they built a dozen buildings, and Pan Am was invited to build their terminal there on Treasure Island. Now, after when the war broke out, the exposition was over, the Navy moved into Treasure Island, and they also had some other facilities there on Treasure Island. We had 2 wonderful hangars for our new Boeing 314s, 30. The Treasure Island Control Tower. Do you see anything besides the control tower? Can you see any of the bridges in the background when you see the control tower? Now, here's a picture of me. Does it look like me? No, I'm a lot older now because now the hat that Bill gave me, it's one of his hats, but now you see the hat that I really had to wear. We're kind of embarrassed to wear this hat because it had a strange look to it. But I'm going to be your pilot today on a flight that I'm going to take you down to Auckland. Now, here's our crew. And you notice John Mack is my first officer. John Mack, and I have the audio recording here, but I don't have time to play it, of John Mack being interviewed at that terminal after they're coming back on one of their flights. And the conversation goes something like this, says the reporter. You were 2 hours late landing. What happened? Well, when you're coming into San Francisco, it's always fogged in, or usually, and sometimes we have to fly around for a while for the fog to burn away. Well, reporter says, what happens if the fog doesn't burn away? Well, we can go 3,600 miles, and we only flew 2,500 miles getting here, so we could go all the way to the Great Lakes if we had to find a place to land. And one time they did land on the American River that's going up to Sacramento? And they landed there, and they put all the passengers in a hotel along the river. They waited till the next day for San Francisco to be clear. They got in their airplane and flew back to Treasure Island. 33. Now, here's our route to Auckland. Now, you see there's a dotted line. There's a dotted line that goes to Kingman Reef, and then it goes to Pago Pago, and then there's a new line. See, that first line was the Martin 130s, and it had trouble reaching some of those islands. And the way I became a chief pilot for Pan Am was my friend I told you about a little bit earlier, Ed Music, was a pilot. He was coming out of Pago Pago. He had engine trouble and decided to go back to Pago Pago, and he had full tanks, so he started to dump the fuel, and something catastrophic happened, and that airplane blew up in a fireball. And we lost our chief captain, and I'm sad to say that I was picked to be the next chief captain in his place, but he was one of the most remarkable pilots you can ever imagine. When I first started taking over in the Pacific, I had 52 flights because I was working the Atlantic for a while. So I had a number of flights across. Oh, what I didn't tell you about Fred Noonan. Fred Noonan, he quit Pan Am because he was gone so much, because these airplanes left on a Monday would land in Manila on Friday or Saturday, depending on how good the weather was. They would be there for 2 days, can come back on Monday, so they'd be gone 2 days. And if there wasn't another crew to take off on Monday, he'd be asked to do it again. So he got really tired of Pan Am, and that is why he left Pan Am when his wife divorced him. So he took a really that easy job working for Amelia Earhart. So he had been remarried for 3 months when he left on Amelia Earhart's mission. Okay, now our first stop that we're going to love. So we have left. We're in Honolulu. We're coming out. Now our first stop is going to be Canton Island. Now, is this a picture of Canton Island?
Yes.
It's an aerial view. Now, Canton Island, do you notice it is nothing but a sandbar going all the way around? I had to, go ahead, the next slide is the Haven ship. The ship, the Haven, my boss, Juan Tripp, hired the ship out for 1 year, and we went out to Wake Island, we went out to Midway Island, and we also stopped here at Canton Island. We had to build the facilities. That freight ship, we had kits for hotels. we built, and the kits of 42 rooms is what we figured. So they carried everything on that ship to build a 42-room hotel that we built. Now, the hardest thing we had to do is each one of these reefs had coral everywhere. So we had to dynamite the coral out of the center of these reefs to a depth of 7 feet. And it had to be about 200 feet wide and about a mile long, and then we put buoys up to know where it was clear so you wouldn't hit the coral. Can you imagine trying to do that today in some of these? So they were dynamiting out the center, and that ship was instrumental in bringing all the fuel and all the supplies to build these little facilities in the middle of nowhere. Canton Island, it was named Canton after a ship out of Newfoundland in Massachusetts, and the ship actually crashed and it went aground at little Spam Island, which is on the left, and the crew actually used their rowboats and rowed for weeks to get to another island to be rescued. But what they found when they visited that island by mistake, it was full of bird poop. And what they found was that was worth a whole lot as fertilizer in the United States, and the British also had co-ownership. For years, they came and filled those ships up, and they cleaned that island clean. All that bird poop was gone and sold for a lot of money back in their hometowns. Now, the facilities, of course, I told you that they're pretty nice facilities. So when we land, we'll land there about 3 o'clock. It's a short flight. So when we're there, we will have you will have the opportunity to walk, but you don't try going all the way around because there's some open places where the inlet is. So just go no more than maybe a 30-minute walk down the sand, and you'll see all the tropical fish in the area. And we'll have, if you want to go out and do a little bit of, I don't know if they had scuba diving equipment, not scuba diving, but snorkeling, and enjoy the nothingness of being out in the middle of nowhere. And we're going to leave at 6 a.m. in the morning because we have to get to the next island of New Caledonia. Okay, there's our aerial view flying overhead. Now, this is a tropical island. This is a paradise. It makes Hawaii look like nothing. New Caledonia is just a fantastic place to go, and we get to show it to you. So we're going to go down and we're going to land at facilities here. And 38. You're going to love the overnight stay on this island because we have in store for you something that you may not have been thinking about. Extraordinary beauty. So are we on the one, is that 30?
39.
39. Extraordinary beauty on New Caledonia Island. Just extraordinary. Now, the best is coming next. We have Fred and Joe is going to entertain you. If you try to enunciate or pronounce their names, we gave up a long time ago. So we call them Joe and Fred. They will be your entertainment for the evening. And then in the morning, we're going to be heading out for Auckland. Auckland is not very far. It is 1,200 miles or so. So we're going to leave at 6 a.m. in the morning. We're going to get you to Auckland, New Zealand. So the flight left at 6 o'clock in the morning. 2 hours out of Auckland, my radio man comes to me and says, we have a problem. We received an HF radio message from Hawaii, from the Pan Am, because that's why you needed 2 radio men. They had HF radios that didn't work half the time, and they're always changing tubes and trying to keep those radios working. And they had to man the radio day and night. Okay, here is the message that came. Pearl Harbor has been attacked. You need to implement Plan A. What I didn't tell you is in my breast pocket, I had an envelope that was given to me at Treasure Island by the Department of Defense of the Navy. It was an emergency plan if we were ever attacked. I had a sealed envelope, and I had to return that sealed envelope at the end of my route 2 weeks later back to the security officer at Treasure Island. If I didn't return that envelope, or I had opened that envelope, I would have been arrested, and I would end up in jail. So in the airplane, I pulled out this message and opened it up. And it said, report to your nearest destination and await further instruction. Well, the nearest destination happened to be Auckland, and we did a landing in Auckland. Now, the other radio man who was listening to the AM radio in New Zealand also confirmed that Pearl Harbor had been attacked. See, what you don't know is the Japanese attacked 99 other tropical areas in the Pacific. You just don't hear that. So everything was getting clamped down. Within a couple of weeks, the Japanese had control of over 100 locations in the Pacific. So we waited a week, but the first order that I got from Pan Am was to fly back to New Caledonia and pick up the ground crew. So we took the risk because we didn't see any Japanese that would threaten us. We got in our airplane, flew back to New Caledonia. We left the passengers in Auckland. We brought back the 30 ground crew that were in New Caledonia because they were in jeopardy. So we brought them back. And then we waited, and then we waited, and then we waited, and then we get another message. We had to wait at the embassy. The message read, you're not going to believe this. The message said, for all of us, because you're on this airplane with me, fly west, you're on your own. So if you can imagine this. They didn't have any navigation maps. They went to the Auckland City Library and checked out all the books on geography and didn't return them. They took them with them. Because I laid them out on the tables and said, what way are we going to go? These maps don't have longitude and latitude. We're going to have to figure out how to get back home. We've already gone 6,000 miles to get here. How are we going to get back home going west? So they took off. A couple days later, they had full fuel. They made it to Australia, and then they needed more fuel, and they said, I'm sorry, we don't have enough fuel for you. You can use automobile gas. We'll give you all the automobile gas you want. Okay, the aviation fuel was 100 octane. Automobile gas is 80 octane. So they had two tanks of the regular 100 octane airplane fuel, so they filled up with automobile 80 octane fuel. And they took off and departed. And once they got to altitude, they switched over the tanks, hoping that this engine would run on 80 octane fuel. And it burped and it coughed, but it ran. And they kept on going. Now, in that area, they let down a little bit later to land at one of the islands, and they saw a Japanese sub on the surface. And they saw men scrambling around trying to get the gun on the deck of the ship working, because that little airplane, remember, only went 180 miles an hour. It would be a clear, easy shot to take down a Boeing 314. But they flew by, and everything went just fine. They flew across northern Africa, across the deserts in that airplane. It can't land on the ground. I mean, it has little wheels, and you have to have a perfect runway. There's nothing like that in Africa. Then they crossed the Pacific. There was the Atlantic. They crossed the Atlantic, and that distance was 2,900 miles, and their tank was only good for 3,600 miles. So they made it across to the east coast of South America. And then they flew up South America through the Caribbean. Now, this very last slide I have is when we arrived near New York. It was 4 o'clock in the morning. It was still dark. And here is the radio call that I had my radio man make to LaGuardia Tower. This is Pan Am NC 18602 inbound from Auckland. They were not expecting anything from that distance, because that was just absolutely unheard of. That tower operator dropped his coffee cup on the floor, and he turned to his boss and said, what do we do? Where do we land an amphibious? We haven't landed an amphibious airplane in our harbor. He said, first thing, we have to wait for the sun to come up. This is LaGuardia Tower. Are you cleared to stay in the air for another 2 hours until the sun rises? And I think the response was, we've been in the air for 31,000 miles. We know what it takes. We're good. We'll circle around until the sun rises. And they landed in New York. That happened to be the longest first commercial airline flight around the world. Not by choice. And the history of that, what happened to Pan Am, why did they go out of business? Juan Trippe stayed with Pan Am until the very end. And the company went out of business because they were aggressive at going after the international flights. They went after all the international flights. But then, unless they had interconnecting flights within the United States, people started going to other airlines because all the other airlines started asking for international flights, and they were given to them. All those airlines got together and would not let Pan Am get the local flights to continue staying in business. So Pan Am went out of business. And that was this flight that I did in 1941, which we were landing in on the morning of December 7th, coming into Auckland. It was the last flight of the Clippers, because during that time with the buildup is every one of those little atolls, the military came in and built runways. There weren't runways there. Our Clipper provided the only way to get to the South Pacific, a very wonderful way to get there. Slow? No, it was extremely fast compared to ships. It only took 5 days instead of a month to get where you wanted to go. So that's the end of Clippers, because soon after were the bigger airplanes that came in and landed on the paved strips that were there on all these little atolls. And the bigger the airplane got, now you're talking DC-4, and then there was a Boeing 307 and a Boeing 377, they no longer had to stop at those little islands. They could fly overhead. And so all those little islands since that time have been totally ignored, unless we heard the last speaker. There's ways to get these little islands, but it's not easy. They became flyover islands. And to watch Pan Am go under, because one trip was incredible. And I lived to be 88 years old. Now, Bill, when I died, you didn't even recognize that I died, and I know where you were. You were a year at school at Naval War College, and you didn't give me the time of day. And now I'm realizing that I'm starting to fade. I have to go back. Oh, what I did was, Greg, will you ring that bell once? Just go ahead and lift it up and give a nice big ring. I brought this bell because when I was coming down St. Peter, I grabbed this bell on the way down because I can use that as a prop. So I came down here, and when you boarded my ship, remember this is a ship, we would get the airplane all prepped, but then we'd ring the bell once, and we marched out. I was first. I was the captain. I had all the crew behind me in order of importance. We marched up the ramp, and we got inside the airplane. And then the bell rang twice. He's learning. That meant it's time for the passengers to board. That's how formal it was to fly with us. We cared about our passengers. Very few could afford these routes, and that ended because all of our airplanes were absorbed by the military, and the flying ships just kind of disappeared because they were too slow with the radial engines, and that era is gone. But I'm hoping you enjoy a little trip with me, even though I'm starting to fade in and out because I have to get back. Because what I found out, the reason I have to get back is they're after me, because I didn't realize the bell I took was the one that they use in heaven to announce when an angel gets his wings. So thank you. I'm glad. I will fade away and see you later. I really appreciate Robert Ford. He's a real gentleman, and it was really a pleasure because he knows a lot more about these airplanes than I ever did. And to have him come for the short amount of time was just phenomenal for me to be able to have him here with us. Now, am I on time? I have no idea. I'm a blind person. I don't know what the time is.
We've got about 5 minutes. We could take a couple questions.
Okay, let's take a couple of questions.
All right. Do you want to pick someone to?
Because I'll pick somebody. You right over there. No.
Are there any questions?
If not, I'll tell you about some of the other things that.
Oh, please ask a question, or he'll start telling more stories.
Because once I start talking, I just won't be quiet. So. Yes.
Yes. Young lady in the front.
I was wondering about pressurization in cabins for commercial aircraft, and the one that you showed, the Clipper itself, did it need to go? Was it at an altitude in which pressurization was necessary?
No, you don't need the cabin pressure until you're above 25,000 feet. You need oxygen from about 18,000 to 25,000 feet, but the airplane never went above that, so you never needed supplemental oxygen. They were not pressurized whatsoever, and that's the reason I washed out of pilot training. The T-37 jet is unpressurized, and which means when you're up there and doing maneuvers like loops and other things, you're going up and down at least 6,000 feet per minute. As like stepping in an elevator and watching it go up 100 feet per second. My sinuses could not clear in an unpressurized jet airplane fast enough. So they ruptured my sinuses twice in pilot training and ended up going to Wilford Hall Medical Hall in Texas for surgery, and traveled on a C-9, which is a white airplane with a big red star cross on the side, being a medical airplane. Carol remembers that day, and she was happy that I was no longer in pilot training. Any other thoughts?
Any other? Yes.
Are there any flippers, any flying boats that are still around, that are still working? Replicas, rebuilds, anything like that? Nothing like this, of course.
None that I actually know of. I can remember when I was a young kid, there were flying boats that was used by the Coast Guard, and I remember going to the San Diego Lindbergh Field Airport, and they had the road closed off, and a 2-engine, this might have been a Sikorsky 38 twin-engine, traffic was stopped, and it went across from the runway, so it landed, and then it went into the water or something, and then it took off or did something in the bay. But I don't know if, what's the big famous airplane you know of that's just down the road? The Spruce Goose. And you heard the story on that, how that was in the late 40s. Now, there's something that you didn't know. The Russians had a plane as large, if not larger, than the Spruce Goose that they made, that they had in an inland lake that they didn't want anyone to see. It was huge, but it flew on, what's the air, what do you call it, on when it flies on the wing with the compression of the air above ground? It flew on ground effect. It flew on ground effect. So it could fly across the oceans and save a considerable amount of energy if it was about 20 feet above the surface. But they never got it out of the lake. They never got it very far, because flying that low in rough seas is just doesn't work most of the time. Had that been successful, or the Spruce Goose. There was a second Spruce Goose that was actually ordered that was canceled because the war was winding down. That was a phenomenal airplane. If you haven't seen it, it's in the area. It's a treasure to see.
And I think that's it.
Okay, I have one Greg story.
No, I said we're out of time.
And the story is, I wanted Greg to be able to experience the same things that I've had the opportunity. So one day, we had a neighbor named Theron Judd who built his own little fiberglass airplane that would fit in a garage, a 2-car garage, easily. So I called Theron. I said, Theron, can you give my son a ride? I think you were 12 years old. Do you remember that flight?
I do, yeah. I loved it.
So we went out to the airport. Now, that airplane was so small, the reason Theron would ask people to go with him, because you had to hand start the propeller. The engine was in the back. I had to sit on the nose, because if he would have started that little motor, it would have been going down the taxiway without anybody in it. So I sat on the front, then we got the engine running, and I had to stay there and hold it from getting away until he got in, because there were no brakes on this airplane. And the back seat canopy was a piece of foam rubber. And Greg got in, and he went for a spin around the airport for about 10, 15 minutes. And then the worst part, when Theron got back, he said, Bill, I want to take you for a ride. And so I had a chance to go on this little teeny airplane with a little 100 horsepower Lycoming engine on it with a pusher prop. We haven't told you a lot of the things that we have done. Okay, so I think we're out of time. It's been a pleasure to be here to support my son. Thank you.